Welcome everyone. It's very exciting. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Cynthia García Coll, whom I'm going to be interviewing today. My name is Jose Causa Diaz. Dr. Cynthia García Coll has made foundational contributions to child development and child psychology. She received her bachelor at the University of Puerto Rico and her PhD at Harvard University. She has served as editor of some of the most important journals, editor-in-chief, one of the most important journals in developmental psychology, including Developmental Psychology and Child Development. She has worked tirelessly to promote the well-being of racial ethnic minority, children of color, Latinx children through activism, participating in organizations such as the Latinx Caucus of SRCD. And also she's made wonderful contributions through her scholarship and her teaching and her theory. So happy to welcome you, Cynthia, and introduce you. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for being here, Jose. I know that we have enough time to do all these extra things, right?
Only the things that matter. So I'm
Only the things that matter. There we go. That sounds good.
This is very important to me and to many others because we really see you as a mentor and a role model, Cynthia, and we have a lot of work left to do. We had a horrible incident happening in Buffalo recently, and we have a lot of work to do to promote the well-being of the development of people of color, especially Black, Indigenous, Latinx. And so we want to talk together about work out some of the challenges that we have ahead. There's much work to be done. I want to start asking you, Cynthia, what drew you to a career in research on child development?
Well, you know, we all have very personal stories. I actually wanted to be a clinical psychologist because I actually didn't know about developmental. So I applied to grad school in the US, and guess what? I wasn't admitted. Partly because my SATs in Spanish were very high, but my GREs in English were very low. I went from the 90th percentile to the 40th percentile. And the only thing that saved me to get into grad school in the US was basically affirmative action. I am a product of affirmative action. And when I see right now, affirmative action is on the Supreme Court right now, it's very sad to see how there is no recognition of how affirmative action was dealing with a historical oppression and exclusion of many of us. So I ended up admitted to a developmental program, and then I fell in love. I fell in love with the research. I had done actually research at the University of Puerto Rico with monkeys and other things at that time. And so I was very much in love with research, but then I fell in love with development. The notion of how we change and remain the same over our lifespan. So I hope that gives you a sense of where I come from. I have said to my students at Brown many times, I can't believe I get a paycheck to do something that I really love, which is understanding, you know, individual differences and group differences in behavior and development over time.
That's wonderful, Cynthia. And I love how you recognize the role of policy in your life, like affirmative action, in your trajectory, your own development as a scholar, the opportunities you had. And also the barriers like standardized test scores that would have kept you out of that initial opportunity.
Right. And it just happened that, you know, the two advisors that I had in my master's and my PhD had both gone to Guatemala to do research, and they were sort of enthralled at that moment by Latin culture and indigenous processes and stuff like that. And they saw in me a person that they could invest in. They saw in me the potential of becoming a real scholar, and they took a chance. I mean, it was, you know, talking to their departments. I know that both of them did that. And I am eternally grateful for people who who see the potential in others, who are willing to move policies and admission things to be able to provide opportunities for those of us who did not have the same opportunities as those who come from scholars, you know, from places that we don't have that particular, you know, experiences and critical resources for our development.
Thank you, Cynthia. And I think you're already saying some of the, you're already addressing the next question. But if you mind sharing more, what are the names of those mentors, and what other mentors influence your work, and what other things influence your work?
Yeah. So I started with Dr. Barry Lester at University of Florida, who really introduced me to the notion that babies had an amazing potential and expression of needs and wants and desires, and how important it was to start with development from very early on. And then when I went to Harvard, I was, you know, there's so many mentors. I mean, one of the things that you have to remember is that there were no Latinos anywhere, but there were no women either. I mean, I didn't have any female mentors because none of the professors in my programs were females. It was all basically white males. So I was, you know, I was very much influenced by Jerry Kagan at Harvard. Also, Dante Cicchetti and I became really good friends at that point. Him as a brand new assistant professor, me as a brand new graduate student, feeling completely out of place in an Ivy League tower. And our building was actually a big white tower in Cambridge, Mass. I also got involved with Barry Brazelton at Harvard Medical School. Barry Lester had moved to that point to work with him. And so I also became very much part of what it was called the Child Development Unit, met everybody there, really looking at the notion of prevention and the notion of really starting as early as possible and really working in systems. So if the baby was coming with any kind of vulnerability, to really work with parents and always thinking about systems. So I've never thought about babies or children as individuals, but very much part of systems of care. And noticed that there were nobody who were talking about culture and ethnicity and race and anything like that. So two things happened. One was Jerry Kagan and Barry Lester had just come back from Guatemala doing research on malnutrition in indigenous populations. And that was my sort of, okay, it's okay to talk about culture, although the constructions of culture at that point were very different. But also I did minors in anthropology. So I trained with the Whitings, Beatrice and John Whiting, with Bob Levine, and others that were doing cross-cultural research in Africa and other places. And so at least I had a theoretical perspective on how to deal with cultures, although it was very much cross-cultural and not necessarily what I invested myself in, which was within culture research, which is what I really started pushing in child development as a really interesting way of understanding cultures. It's not pitting one against the other, which one is more advanced or which one is the most this or that, but really thinking about each culture as a microsystem, as a macrosystem, as a microcosm, no? Cosmos, to really think about children within those, children and families within those constellations.
And I really like that argument you make about not comparing, and I appreciate you bringing your own journey, moving to Massachusetts and getting all these mentors. But before you move there, I want to ask you about Puerto Rico. I want to ask you about La Isla del Encanto, because you had mentors in Harvard, but I also know you were mentored by your own people, by women.
That's exactly
Puerto
right.
Rican women.
Yes.
And I think starting with your academic mentors it's like the second chapter, but can you tell me about how being Boricua shaped you
Oh
in your
my
work
God.
and
Yeah.
how you saw role models in your own community in Puerto Rico,
Yes.
strong women
Yes.
uh,
Yes.
that
Yes.
informed the
Yes.
way you think and work?
Yes. So I'm the product, I'm a only child from a single mom who basically invested everything she had in me. And look where she brought me. It's been an amazing life and an amazing life story. And she was very much into education, you know, and I was exposed to the best education I can ever imagine, including from second grade on. I was in an experimental school by one of the leading educators here in Puerto Rico that, you know, I was learning English, Spanish, and French on second grade. And teaching was an immersion on the culture. So, you know, when I go to Paris, I know where Notre Dame is and where l'Arc de Triomphe and where everything is because I learned it so early, learning a language within its culture. And it was a fantastic education, primary education. So I was basically trilingual by the age of, you know, of 12. And then I moved to a school that was University of Puerto Rico High School. So it was an experimental school too. And my teachers, both females and male teachers, were very much into pushing critical thinking, into thinking about everything, history, math, science, from a perspective of, well, yeah, you can think about 2 + 2, but what do we do with math? How do we apply math in real life? And how do we deal with issues that are seminal to our culture and our society? So I went to the US, basically, well, I went to the University of Puerto Rico first in the time where we were very much in the 1960s. This was the 70s in Puerto Rico. And so all the questioning, all the really considering why things are done, you know, there was this great saying that I laugh about it now, that it was question anybody who's over 30. So that was our logo at that time. And so we got involved in political battles, and was talking to somebody when we created the first strike to be able to wear pants to go into high school. And we went and met with the president of the University of Puerto Rico and said, look, you know, this is the 1970s now, everybody else is doing it, why not us? And lo and behold, they allow us. So the activism came very early on. My mother was also very, very political. And so we used to be involved. And so I grew up with a sense of awe at education, a sense of discovery, a sense of questioning things when they didn't feel right, to me in particular, and to find others, to find community, to find camaraderie in all of these struggles and fights. And that's where I come from a mother, a grandmother, very strong women who really believed in education as a major investment for me.
Thank you, Cynthia, for sharing that that experience in Puerto Rico. And we know Puerto Rico has dealt with, is dealing with issues of colonialism, and as many other societies in Latin America, anti-indigenous systems, culture, anti-Black culture, very strong. We have challenges with racism within our countries, and we're dealing with colonialism. So how these experiences in growing up in Puerto Rico that you internalize, how they're connected to you becoming focused on minority and or marginalized children in the US?
Yeah, so what was fascinating for me coming to the US was that I basically became decolonized in the US. which is a really interesting way of thinking about this, right? That you come to the colonial power and then you realize, wait a second, I mean, these are not gods, and this is not all perfect, and this is not all equal, and there's no many injustices. And all of a sudden you realize that, you know, if you don't speak up or you don't stand up, who else is going to do it? You know, I had all the privilege of a great education, both in Puerto Rico and in the US. And how could I not use my privileges to better not only the understanding of our communities, but also the sort of application of our knowledge? And the first thing that really struck me was the colonial perspective of our science. And I'm just going to give you a very, very concrete example. I'm doing my master's thesis in Puerto Rico on teenage moms, and I'm, you know, at the University of Florida completing my master's degree. And I realized the whole literature was completely negative, only thinking about all the negativity that engenders being pregnant and having a child and mothering when you are a teenager. But, you know, my own grandmother had been a teenager. She had 10 kids, been a widow at the age of 30. And when I met her in her 50s and 60s, she didn't seem like this horrible, you know, mother. You know, she had 10 kids, and then she was widow, and she was still 30, and, you know, she had a very hard life. So I went to Puerto Rico and did all these assessments, and lo and behold, I find that teenage mothers don't look any different than older mothers at that point. And I start saying, you know, there are some biases in this knowledge that then we try to impose in other populations. So that was the first time that I got, that I was shocked about how the knowledge base was off, that the knowledge base needed to be rectified, that all of these processes, both of cultural strength and oppression, both at the same time, were creating particular circumstances for families and kids that, you know, needed to, they were not into this boxes of right and wrong, but they were continuums of human adaptation that had to do with environmental demands. And, you know, it was like, I looked around and I said, oh dear, who do I align with? Who are my partners in this life task of really shifting a whole academic field to recognize and confront their own biases and their blind spots? And that was a major realization where I started then shifting my career from, you know, up to that point, I had been working with babies and temperament and other stuff. And I said, this is great, this is wonderful, I love it, but, you know, there has to be some other place where I can get this revisionist point of view into the field.
Thank you, Cynthia. I really appreciate your connection between your lived experience in Puerto Rico with your mother and your grandmother, and seeing that these women that were became mothers when they were adolescents, they were not at all reflected in the literature. And this is fast forwarding because you did so much in between, but I want to focus a little bit on the integrated model, which addresses some of the issues you're bringing up. And I think it's kind of like you and your colleagues coming together and coming up with a response that has people like me who came up after you. We have really benefit from the foundation you and other scholars have laid out by addressing these deficits and focusing on competences. So I want to ask you, can you please describe how you see these connections between race, ethnicity, culture, and class, and now we're benefit from learning about intersectionality. So how do you see the
I know, I mean, we were talking about intersectionality, but we didn't have that that wonderful word for that. You know, that theoretical model took about 4 years to distill. And the group of us were funded by the Bureau of Maternal and Child Health. The director was Dr. Gontram Lamberti, and he was also a Puerto Rican who felt completely like a fish out of water, having gone to Johns Hopkins and, you know, having had the amazing experiences that we both share in terms of really receiving an amazing education. And so he gave us funding for us to meet. And it took us about 4 years to come up. I mean, every single one of those boxes were days and days of debate, of coming from, you know, we have pediatricians, we have sociologists, we have psychologists, both clinical and developmental. We were a very mixed, which has always been part of my work, has always been the notion of interdisciplinary and mixed disciplinary ways of looking at the phenomena. And he was the one who really said, you know, we really need to put something out there that can, he had the vision, we did the work, but he had the vision of what needed and funded us on that way. And, you know, it's been amazing to see that framework really helping and supporting so many more recent scholars to be able to feel what I've heard is, you know, we feel validated. We feel like both the notion of the oppression and the racism and the poverty and the class, everything, all that negativity, but then culture and strength in family and children really helping both. You need the demands, you need the crisis, and you need the supports to be able to come up with competencies that you have to have, some of them very much part of any life experience as a child, in a family, in a culture, etc., but also very much part of what are the alternative competencies that we as minoritized, and I love that word, that's a brand new word, minoritized populations are subjected to. And, you know, it has gone into pediatrics, it has gone into sociology, it has gone into all different places. And I just feel like so an amazing gratitude to have been able to be part of that process and to be, you know, the one that pushed it through to fruition, because it was a lot of work. It was a lot of work.
Thank you, Cynthia. I appreciate how you bring up the issue of democracy and how you have debate and different perspectives in this project that led to the creation of the integrated model. Mm-hmm. Much of your work has led to paradigm shifts like this. And so we're talking about democracy and the discipline, and we see in professional societies a reaction to democracy when people elect a Black female leadership, and you know how people react to that. So you have some experiences growing up in Puerto Rico in the 60s, but now we have new challenges in the field and in society and in the United States and Puerto Rico. So what do you see the next shifts that the field of child development should undertake?
Yeah, I remember that I left the US in 2011. Hardly, the main reason was that, you know, I was seeing these anti-immigrant, anti-Black, anti-Indigenous movements coming up. And I just felt ethically I couldn't be contributing to a certain extent in a country that I was feeling like all of our scholarship was being completely negated, you know, that it was not being paid attention by the politics and the policies that were coming up. You know, two things have happened since I left the US in 2011. One is that we used to talk about symbolic and microaggressions as the way that racism was being expressed, but now overt, you know, violent racism is becoming more a norm than an exception. And that is a terrible development in the last 10 years in the US and in the world for that matter, because we're seeing that notion. We just had a conference on the construction of the other, that construction of the other is really creating fundamentalism, is really creating a sense of, they are taking things away from us. They are, they're coming here to erode our way of life, etc. So now it's open, right? Now the violence that was being subdued, and well, you don't look Puerto Rican, like that's the kind of message that I would get. Or why don't you just go back to your own country, kind of stuff that I would get in there. Or don't be so emotional, calm down, you're being too expressive. You don't need to yell. I mean, that the kind of more subtle. Now it's, open, blatant. We've seen the attacks on the Asian American populations, and we see the continuing decimation of Black youth and Black families in the US. So I think that our work that we started, in the 1980s, and at least I started in the 1980s and 90s, is now more urgent. We need to really speak up. We really need to use our science in ways that at least there is a constructive voice out there, a constructive voice that sort of talks about the strength and the adaptations that families do on a daily basis, and children and adolescents do on a daily basis in a world that is very much hostile right now. The hostility is really out there. And so these competencies that we're talking about, being able to deal with racism, of being able to have a healthy ethnic identity, of being able to feel proud of your ancestry and where you're coming from, all of that kind of stuff. We need to put that scholarship out way over and over again. I mean, we are really fighting a big movement in the world to homogenize all of us, to make us look the same, to make us consumers of the same culture, and to really erode everything that we feel proud and that we bring with us, that it's a good contribution to the world. So it's an urgent place. I feel that urgency, and I am just so happy to see the myriads of younger scholars and the next generation just, pushing through all these things that some of us had to do 10 times more, but they are exactly the same battles. We just need to stand up and speak up and use our science.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. I appreciate you bring competences and pride and pride in ancestry, ethnic racial identity. That's been such an important focus of your work. How can we use those competences in your work in promoting competences to support and promote racial and sociocultural equity in research, practice, and policy?
Absolutely.
And to support system change, right? Because we're talking about, we get distracted with the bad apples, but how can we support a change that confronts racism, discrimination, and prejudice at the system level?
Right. And, I just put out a model, another theoretical model with a group of my students that we talked, we took Bronfenbrenner, instead of putting culture out there, in the periphery, very far away from the kids, I brought culture into the microsystems. And that's how we need to think about what we need to do, that the places, some of us work at the macro and some of us work at the micro. Psychologists, we tend to work on the micro, and that's what we need to work on. And so we cannot think about individuals, but we need to think about how systems, and I mean by that, preschools, schools are a tremendous place to be able to deal with these issues. Although right now, we have this backlash against, anti-racist movement within schools and in any other public place, and against, all the books and everything that we think are very important. So we need to be putting out the science. We need to be showing people that bringing about knowledge of oppression, of racism, of everything that our ancestors did or received, that acknowledging that history is a very important part of being able to be, in a world where we are all interconnected, when we are all interdependent, and where, as I used to say, joking in Providence, Rhode Island, when I used to give talks to older people, I would say, if you think that school dropout, that happened in the inner city in Providence, it's not going to affect you, I want you to be thinking that a lot of the kids of color are going to be in your nursing home, shifting your knob. And if they don't have a good education, that might be terrible for you. So don't think that what happens in the inner city does not affect somebody who lives in the suburb. I mean, we just don't see it. You just don't see it on a daily basis. But we are all interdependent. And we need to really think about what and how do we create spaces, school, health, family, neighborhoods, where the strength of the populations are supported at the same time that we all become bicultural or multicultural. It's not me learning how you do it in this particular place. Is this particular place also learning from me and from my family and from my ancestry, all the amazing adaptations, everything that we bring into as human beings, into this particular, communication, into this particular collaboration, into this particular building things together. And, we need to use the science. I mean, seriously, we need to think about working with science writers and other people, or write more, more popular books at the same time that we publish our academic books.
I really appreciate you making that segue into, we need to put out the science and work with publishers. And you said before the importance of promoting science in the classroom, especially when we see these anti-science movement pushing out critical race theory, pushing out evidence of oppression. And that's a great segue into my next question. Mm-hmm. How have you pursued equity through your work as editor? Because we know being a journal editor, you're in charge of promoting new avenues. I know you push for a sociocultural policy that people have to describe their samples explicitly, but you also open up for special issues. You push for representation in reviewers and editors, action aid associated. So can you tell me more about how you pursue equity, and what else is left to do as editors to pursue equity in our work that can impact communities and can address systems of oppression?
Yes. Well, I became editor not by my choice. It's not that I enjoy editing journals or writing reviews or anything like that. I felt that I had to do it. I felt that we needed to take over the editorial ships, and the two main, it was developmental psychology for 6 years, and then child development for 6 years. I mean, that's 12 years of an academic life that you basically, with 3 kids that I had at the same time, chair of my department or president of the faculty. I mean, I was always ending up in leadership positions. I guess I should learn how to shut up, but I don't know how to do that. And so, I get picked up for these positions. And those two I pursue very, very clearly. And why I did that at the point when I did it was because I was seeing a lot of my colleagues, brilliant people of color who were not getting tenure anywhere in the US because their scholarship was not being published in the top journals. They could, like in 1990, we had a special issue, on minoritized children, but it was special issues when you do that, when you put things on a special issue or in a specialized, how do you say that, in a specialized journal, only the people who are interested in that topic learn about it. So I don't like the same way that I talk about segregation in the, in the integrative model, segregation of literature, segregation of power, segregation of who gets funded, who gets tenure, who gets published, really shapes a field. And I said to myself, you know what? Somebody's got to do it. I don't see anybody else. I'm going to step up and take it. And so what I did in both places was the first thing is to look around and see who's going to be the board. Because the board and the reviewers are the gatekeepers, right? They're the ones with the editor, they're the ones who define what is good science, right? What in this particular time and place we define as good science.
And what is good science, Cynthia?
What is it?
And what is good science? Because that can be a loaded question, right? Good science is colorblind.
Amazing. Good for the question. Thank you. For me, good science is science that it's basically valid, that it takes into account the populations that it's studying and doesn't come up with one paradigm that just adapts, or move from one population to the other without really taking into consideration the history, the capacities, where is the population? So at some point we used to compare Blacks and whites without really thinking about anything of their context or their history. And lo and behold, using measures that were standardized in the white culture, the other culture, the Black, the Latino, every single one of them looked efficient, right? And so I started seeing that this was the need of a paradigm shift to be able to take into consideration context seriously, okay? And we are all love Bronfenbrenner, but most of us don't pay any attention. We cite him, and then in our methods and results, analysis, and interpretation, we never use it again. So I was like, no more of this, no more of putting in the front in introduction something that it's not used anymore. So I, in both places, in developmental psychology and in child development, I basically found the most amazing associate editors from all over the world. Not the US, not Europe, from all over the world. So we had people in Hong Kong, and we had people in Australia, and we had people in South America and Central America. And, I really went out of my way to make that, that review board as representative of the world as possible. And lo and behold, in 2010, the weird populations, some Canadians decided that, look at the field of psychology as in general. I was talking with child development only, but they opened the field to really think about why do the knowledge base is based all on weird populations that do not represent the world at large. And that comes up with stereotypes, with ways of always finding deficits on the other and not confronting our own biases. And so, I left 12 years of my career basically as editor because somebody's got to do it. Somebody had to. And I was there at the point where some few knew that this was the way to go and allow me to bring about a difference of worldview on how science needs to be contextualized, how science needs to be responsive, and then how do we use that science to create environments that are responsive, supportive to the populations in place.
Thank you, Cynthia. I really appreciate your own sharing how you were invited to these positions of leadership, right? In professional organizations, in academic organizations. Now, our role as teachers and professors, we also need to prepare the next generation of leaders. So I want to ask you, how should universities, how should schools be transforming? So instead of reproducing oppression, we can have a mindset of liberation, and we can allow this power shift not only across gender and racial lines, but you mentioned a representation, geographic representation. We're conducting this interview in English, even if both of us are native Spanish speakers.
That's right.
So a lot of the work we do shuts out, keeps people out that, most of the people in the world speak other languages other than English. So how can we who are in charge of teaching can transform the way we're preparing the next generation of leaders?
Right. And what we need to create is pipelines. It's create pipelines for others to be able to replace us and to challenge us and to make us think differently, because that's part of science and that's part of growth and development. And one of the most gratifying aspects of my career has been, mentoring. I don't teach, I mentor. I don't know how to teach. I don't use PowerPoints. I don't use, I don't teach. I mean, I'm very much into a Socratic method. So I start my classes by posing questions and hearing from people, and, but mentoring to see in front of you this wonderful person that you see all their potentials. You see them, I meet a student, and, I met somebody, a Filipino woman last week in the meeting of the construction of the other, and I fell in love with her, and I invited her to write something with me, because I see in her the same way as I saw in you, the same way as I saw in many other people, that I see this potential, and I see this amazing wealth of knowledge and experience that needs to be incorporated into our academic work, so it becomes humanized again. It's not variables. We're not variables. We are complex systems of many, many thousands of variables that we need to deal with. And that complexity, for me, it's fascinating to see in somebody that I see as a young undergraduate, or as a young graduate student, or as a young assistant professor, to be able to see in them the potential, and then 5-10 years later, see them just blossoming, going off, creating trouble, questioning, entrepreneurship, creating new centers, new things, new that. I must tell you, that's the favorite part of everything that I've done, is to see you guys, creating and moving on and doing all the wonderful things that you do.
Thank you, Cynthia.
It's a privilege.
And that's one way you describe yourself, a troublemaker. And I appreciate you showing a troublemaker as an editor, a troublemaker as a professor, as a mentor.
As a chair of the department, as a faculty, when I was president of the faculty at Brown, that's when we abolished, and this was in the 1990s, where we abolished Columbus Day, and it became Indigenous Day. We were the first Ivy League and one of the first universities in the 1990s. Students came to me and said, you know what, this needs to be done. I said, you know what, let's work on this together. And we convinced 600 white males, full professors at Brown, that this was the way to go.
And that's a great example, a segue into policy that addresses both symbolic and structural issues that we have ahead. So I want to ask you, what are the most pressing policy and practice issues that you see in Puerto Rico and in the US today? And how do you think, we talk about editorialship, we talked about training and mentorship. So we're closing to the end. I want to ask about policy and structural changes that can survive us. So what do you see as the most pressing, or some of the most pressing issues, not only in the US, but you're in Puerto Rico, also in the island?
In the island, of course. I mean, the main issue that we have right now, I think, in terms of human development is inequality. Okay, and inequality involves class, gender, sex, all of the isms, right? All of the isms. And I would like us to be talking about inequality and inequality index as and I know that the United Nations has it. They have a human development index that talks about that. But, you know, inequality is, for me, the core of why some populations are being oppressed, maintained down, on their feet, literally, on their knees, literally, and everything else. So, you know, the creation of the other, which was the conference that we just had in Puerto Rico, was the notion that, yes, we as human beings are sort of biased from very early on to think about us and them. You know, we are cultural beings. By the age of three, you know what the cultural rules are very much in place. What boys and girls are like, men and women are like, who is valued or not valued in society. You know if somebody has an accent like you and I, our kids, you know, my kids make fun of my accent still. I mean, all of that kind of stuff is there. And so what happens is, as we start thinking about other populations are either stealing or taking away our, in one of the most, we have so much resources and so much money and so much knowledge in the US that, you know, to think that, you know, we are not going to be all have access to good health care, to good housing, to good neighborhoods, to good schools, to families that are supported in the important work of bringing about the next generation. If we can imagine that, then we are basically doomed. For me, inequality and inclusion, I mean, inclusion is great to get together and, you know, deal with diversity and have, but for me, it's inequality. It's the notion that we have some fundamental human rights. And in a world where it has so many resources for some and so little for others, that should be a shameful reaction. The US should feel ashamed of maintaining, of having the infant mortality that it has, of having kids dropping out, of having kids that can't find decent jobs because of the color of their skin or because of their accent or because they are undocumented or whatever it is. So for me, the policies have to be thinking about how do we stamp out inequality in every single aspect of human endeavor, from, you know, having music lessons to having adults in your life that have enough resources themselves that can be there for you as a resource. That would be it. And I would use that as a framework for everything that a president should do, that a governor should do, that a board of directors should do. How are we dealing with inequality? What are the actions, the particular actions? It's not a mission statement only. It's not, I believe I'm anti-racist. It's how do you deal with that on a daily basis? How are you creating the policies and conditions for families and children of any color, of any kind, of any place to have a decent chance at life?
That's wonderful, Cynthia. I really appreciate this conversation. I really enjoyed. learning more about you and your work. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Muchas gracias, Jose.
And this is a great opportunity, and we're going to have a full event where we're going to have a chance to go deeper into these issues, and I look forward to that. But I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I'm very grateful to the Foundation for Child Development for organizing and bringing us together.
Me too.
And I appreciate you making time to talk to me. And thank you so much. Muchas gracias, Cynthia.
Un amor. Gracias.
Gracias, un amor.
Bye bye. Ciao.
Bye.